Good evening to all of you. Hope all of you enjoyed the festivities of Holi and Shab Barat. And today is Good Friday, the day which commemorates the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Many commemorate this event by fasting and attending services at the church. This day marks the betrayal of Christ by Judas. 2 days later, on Easter Sunday, the Lord was resurrected. He came back from the dead. So have a blessed Good Friday. May the sacrifice our Savior give you strength, and may His blessings always be with you and your family. Today, we are going to hold our 47th lecture, and we have Professor Prashant Keshavmurthy, who is going to discuss Bedil's Bisemic Ghazal poetics. Maulana Abul Mani Mirza Abdul Qadir Bedil, also known as Bedil Dehlavi, was an Indian Sufi who is considered as one of the greatest Indo-Persian poets, probably at par with greats like Khusro. He was a contemporary of Aurangzeb and was the foremost representative of the latter phase of the Indian style, that is Sabak-e-Hindi, of Persian poetry, and the most difficult and challenging poet of that school. At the heart of his reception, consequential for the national literary canons of Iran, Afghanistan, India, Pakistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan, and formative for the poetics of Ghalib and Iqbal are his ghazals. Though he also wrote in every other Persian verse genre, and ghazal was his and his period's primary site of poetic creativity, Prashant would unravel this enigmatic poet and his ghazals for us. Prashant Keshavmurthy is Associate Professor of Persian Iranian Studies at the Institute of Islamic Studies, McGill University. His research interests include literary theory and the commentarial practices in pre-colonial Persian and Urdu literary traditions and political thought in the Persianate world. He is the author of Persian Authorship and Canonicity in Late Mughal Delhi, Building an Art, which was published by Routledge in 2016. It is a study of poetics and politics in the work of the poet Abdul Qadir Bedil. And his circle and several essays, the most recent of which is The Limits of Islamic Civility in India, in Milad Bilani and Vasilios Adrahta's edited work, Islam, Civility, and Political Culture, which was published in 2020. Personally, I have benefited much from my intermittent interactions with him on the Facebook. He has also been a great help in providing many research papers and even some books which I needed. We met long time back, only once briefly in fact, at the University Guest House at Aligarh, if my memory doesn't fail me. He had come to AMU to consult some manuscripts at the Maulana Azad Library. I am thankful to him that he accepted our request to be here this evening. Please welcome Dr. Keshavmurthy. Over to you, Prashant.
Yeah, I'm audible, right? So thank you so much, Professor Razavi and Shagufta for inviting me, and thank you all of you for your attention and indulgence. So this is a paper about 50 minutes long that I hope to publish, and it's work in progress. And so I'll start reading in the interest of time, and we have slides that Shagufta will show you when I prompt her to. So the topic, as Professor Razavi said, is Bedil's Bisemic Ghazal poetics. So the modernization of poetic practice across Asia and Africa from the early 20th century onward was its increasingly exclusive identification with lyric, understood, as in Europe of the time, as the verbal expression of the inner states of a biographically particular individual. The ghazal is only one of two pre-modern Persianate poetic forms, the other being the rubai or quatrain, to have survived this early 20th century revolution of free verse. It survived in Persian, Urdu, Turkish, Pashto, and other Persianate languages because certain of its practitioners and readers recognized in its poetics elements of what could be recombined to meet the requirements of the preeminent modern poetic form, the lyric. And yet, the very terms on which the ghazal was admitted into literary modernism obscure the legibility of its history. What began in Hegel's exaltation of the lyric in his lectures on aesthetics as the only way in which the poet becomes a self-bounded subjective entity. This is Hegel's phrase, early 19th century. And in John Stuart Mill's vastly influential 1833 pronouncements of the lyric, quote, "The peculiarity of poetry appears to us to lie in the poet's utter unconsciousness of a listener," unquote. And, quote, "Poetry's feeling confessing itself to itself in moments of solitude," unquote, was normalized in university literary criticism by 1957 when Northrop Frye declared that the lyric is, quote, "preeminently the utterance that is overheard," unquote. And Michael Bakhtin contrasted novelistic heteroglossia with the aristocratic monoglossia of the epic and the romantic solipsism of the lyric. This anti-theatrical conception of the lyric as the individual's whispering to herself recognizably assumes the atomistic individual of romanticism and liberal political philosophy. Correspondingly, the many critiques of this model of the lyric, from structuralist and feminist to post-structuralist, Bakhtinian and Marxist, took the liberal romantic model of the lyric as object of critique. Admitted into modernism, the ghazal was valorized and vilified as lyric. What fell out of view as a result was the value of pre-colonial models of the ghazal for a non-European counter-narrative of Persianate selfhood. What models does the pre-colonial ghazal offer us for a reimagination of the lyric subject? This question begs two others. What distinguishes lyric models of the subject, of the human subject, and what is distinctive about early modern instances of such lyric subjectivity? So could we have the first slide, please? All right. Repurposed for the pre-colonial ghazal, or repurposed with the pre-colonial ghazal in mind, I propose another definition of lyric to sort of push back against an early, sort of a 19th century definition of the lyric, European definition, which has played havoc with the reception of the ghazal. Right. So repurposed for the pre-colonial ghazal, I propose another definition. The lyric is the non-scholastic linguistic practice in the adjectival rather than verbal mode of negotiating the disturbance of selfhood by desire. In other words, the lyric is a non-academic practice of verbally fixing or stabilizing states of being in response to the self's erotic incoherence to itself. Not only are lyric responses to such erotic disturbance not verbal or action-centric, they are also not the same as disciplinary responses. The principle of a ghazal's unity lies in the semantic autonomy of its distichs and the particular oral, rhythmic, syntactic, and tropological resolutions therein, not in the institutional or madrasa disciplines by which, too, the passions might have been quelled. The qasida or panegyric in the ghazal was sites for the rhetorical disciplining of bodily drives that might otherwise have been submitted to ascetic, medical, and mystical disciplines. Indeed, the very fact that the Persian ghazal was not taught in madrasas for most of its history testifies to its aesthetic rather than disciplinary autonomy. Not only did such institutional independence make the ghazal a site of popular and non-scholarly cultural literacy, it also afforded its listeners an emotionally richer model of selfhood than the metaphysical austerity of Avicenna, Ibn Sina, and Avicennianism on love. This is already evident in Muhammad al-Ghazali's book on love, volume 36 of his famous 40-volume Ihya Ulum ad-Din, the revivification of religious sciences. He died in 1111 and was arguably the most famous Sufi theologian of medieval Islam. This is already evident in his in volume 36 of his 40-volume work, which is volume 36 is dedicated to love. And its aim is to impel its readers to imitate God's friends or awliya, saints, in their simultaneous knowledgeability about God's names and attributes and their bewilderment at the self-concealment of God's essence. This distinction between love and bewilderment, between loving knowledge and bewilderment, right? This distinction framing Ghazali's volatile discourse on love keeps it from the sort of step-by-step systematicity that we see in his expositions of profane knowledges in the earlier books of his 40-volume work, Revival, and also in Avicenna and the 10th century philosopher-physician Abu Bakr al-Razi on love. It explains the unimportance of the lyric to Avicenna and Al-Razi, but also the appeal of the Ghazal to the Ghazali brothers, Muhammad and Ahmad, as well as the importance of Sufi psychology to the Ghazal. It's in this sense that the lyric is the practice of non-disciplinary and non-narrative, but descriptive resolution of erotic confusion. If this is what distinguishes pre-colonial Ghazal lyric models of selfhood, what's special about the early modern lyric? The answer lies in the increased availability of books, complementing the rise of mercantilism to vastly greater numbers of people across the world from around 1500. The complementarity of Gutenberg's printing revolution with Martin Luther's emphasis on direct individual access to scripture is only the European counterpart to the expansion of the vernacular reading public in contemporaneous Ming China and the editorial and bibliographical projects overseen by the Prince Sultan Hussein Bayaqara in what we today call the Herat efflorescence of late 15th century Herat. Right? The enhanced social depth and the geographical scale of the bureaucracies of the Ming, Safavid, Ottoman, and Mughal states enabled a culture of what Khalid al-Ruhayyab is called deep reading. What this meant for the lyric was the emergence of a kind of poem that was composed with the expectation that you would have to linger on it before it made sense or yielded up its significant sense. The thousands of Persian, Turkish, and Urdu ghazals composed between 1500 and 1800 were written to be read silently on the page rather than only or mainly recited or sung is immediately evident to any reader. If you only encounter the ghazals of Sa'ib of Tabriz, who dies in 1676, who we'll encounter later in this presentation, Kalim of Kashan, 1651, or Ghani of Kashmir, dies in 1669, if you encounter the ghazals only through sung performance, you simply wouldn't have the time you would need to catch what the muscular syntax and pun-drunk lexical density was doing to the verse's meaning. So if you look at slide 2, could we have slide 2, please? Shagufta? We need slide 2. If this is to... Is slide 2 not working? Or the presentation not working? I'll read on in the interest of time. We need slide 2. Okay. There we go. I won't read that translation out that I've made, but you have it there in case you want to pore over it. So you wouldn't have the time. You would need to catch what you would need to catch through, silently rather than visually, is what I'm arguing. Although I know that certain other scholars of early modern poetry disagree with me. Professor Philip Ludgendorff, who's a scholar of the Ramcharitmanas, disagreed with me in my conversation with him. But it's a topic for I'm open to persuasion on. So these ghazals were composed on the assumption that you would have one or more of the period's most famous dictionaries of poetic phrases near at hand, Persian poetic phrases, and as we will see, that you had access to written rather than only remembered archives of scores of other ghazals these were responding to, such as, for example, Bedil's Bayaz that I'm drawing on for this talk. With respect to this new model of lyric, then, the normal temporality of reading was one of lulled or arrested attention. From around 1500, in all of the world's large empires, it became possible for the high prestige poem to part ways with song. One consequence of the bibliocentrism of the early modern lyric was its openness to non-scholarly authors and readers. For all that the lyric was what I call the non-disciplinary resolution of erotic disturbance, its early canon was dominated by scholar poets like Sa'di, Attar, Khaqani, Anvari, Rumi, Amir Khusro, and Hafiz, whose lyric corpus invokes various syntheses of Avicennian peripateticism and Ghazali Sufi piety. In other words, until around 1500, the canonical authors of the Persian Ghazal drew on categories from ambient madrasa disciplines. This is not true of most of the canonical poets writing after 1500, whose professional identities, traders, administrators, doctors, poet laureates, are telling in this respect. In the poetry of Sa'ib, Kalim, Ghani, Bedil, Ghalib, among others, we observe a valorization of the poetic imagination as a faculty almost autonomous of any other, justifying the poet's often professed distance from institutional and madrasa learning. Right? So even a superficial knowledge of the biographies of Sa'ib or Ghalib or Urfi would tell us that these were not great scholars, nor did they claim to be. Right? It was possible to be a great poet without being a great scholar, right? Which is not the case with Sa'di or Hafiz, right? The sheer number of Persian poets active between 1500 and 1800, evidenced in the greater number of tazkiras or biographical anthologies from this period than in any other earlier period, is evidence of a culture of Persian and Persianate poetry in which it was possible by this time to attain high literary prestige without being learned in the disciplines of the seminary or Sufi hospice, and by the ingenious metaphorical appropriation instead of a range of urban practices. It was not your erudition that was on display. It was your metaphorical ability to appropriate a variety of what were largely urban practices as metaphors for traditional themes in the ghazal, right? It is to this early modern lyric milieu of poetic rather than disciplinary learning that Abdul Qadir Khan Bedil belongs. The rest of my paper moves in two steps. First, to propose by a close comparison of one of his ghazals composed in response to three others by other poets, that his poetics was bisemic, in other words, that it was amenable to interpretation in two codes at once, as lyric formulations of the theistic monism of the tradition of Ibn Arabi, the 13th century Andalusian and North African Sufi, whose metaphysics had become the default ontology of anyone educated at the Persianate world by Bedil's time. In the case of India, anyone with any connection at all to the Mughal state, right? And as lyric applications of Hindu Advaitic monism in its courtly adaptations into Persian, as well as in its popular presence in the verse of North India Sant or vernacular saint poets. Second, I argue that his ghazal innovations surpassed such imitatively articulated self-differentiation by considering distichs from two of his ghazals composed in meters that were rare to non-existent in Persian, but common in Arabic, Sanskrit, and Hindavi, or Avadhi, suggesting an acoustic oral replication of Sanskritic devotional intensity while remaining just within the bounds of rhythmic and imagistic intelligibility in Persian. So these are the two moves I'm going to make in this paper. In his thus far unpublished bayaz or notebook, which I consulted in British Library in London, Bedil arranged ghazals in order of poetic excellence rather than chronology, beginning with a ghazal that he thought best rendered a sequence of topoi or themes, mazamin, its poetic priority marked with a horizontal red ink stroke above its first letter. Consider the first ghazal in the ghazal chain that opens the notebook. Could we have the next slide, please? We need the next slide. So, this ghazal is by Sa'ib of Tabriz, who dies in 1677. He spent 7 years, the prolific poet from Safavid Isfahan, who spent 7 years in Mughal courts, and whose ghazals were key to whose 7 years there were key to his literary fame, and whose corpus of around 7,000 ghazals was a stylistic threshold in the genre. That this ghazal opens Bedil's notebook is telling. It signals Sa'ib's paradigmatic status in Safavid Mughal ghazal practice, as well as being Sa'ib's poetic manifesto. In this case, a meta-poetic prayer for poetic inspiration addressed to the divine beloved. All the ghazals in this chain, including Bedil's, replicate this I-thou relationship, even as they treat it variously. Here is distich 1 of Sa'ib's ghazal. I'll just read out the Persian to give you a sense of the meter. It's Hazaj, right? Makon bi bah le yarab az qabul dil bayanam ra bizahre chashm khuban al bedeh tighe zabanam ra. Right? This is the meter in which all the ghazals in this chain are composed. Don't deprive my poetry, Lord, of a share in the approbation of hearts. Grant my tongue sword luster by venom from the eyes of the beautiful. This is a play on the arch topos of the ghazal, the abjectly deprived lover and the cruel beloved. Sa'ib backs up his clearly worded opening prayer for acceptance by readers by asking to be treated cruelly by beloveds. But he does this through a compound metaphor and a pun. He asks that his tongue's sword be granted luster or saliva, ab means both here, by the poisoned glances of the beautiful. The second hemstick concretely backs up the abstraction of the first. This is an example of the technique of illustration, tarz-e tamsil, for which Sa'ib was known or renowned, and which he here uses for an invocation of what is arguably the world's oldest living tradition of masochistic poetics, the ghazal lover's eroticization of the suffering his beloved inflicts on him. The next slide, please. Right. So empty-handedness doesn't bring the leaf fall of nothingness at its wake. Guard my rose garden from the night assault of springtimes. The second distich extends the image in the first of poetic speech as whetted by deprivation to lustrous sharpness by asserting that empty-handedness does not bring the leaf fall of nothingness in its wake. Possessing nothing, you have nothing to lose. As if to render this commonsensical claim strange, the second hemstick prays that his garden be kept from the night assault of springtimes. In Persian poetic convention, as in reality, springtime connotes color. Night assaults take place in colorless darkness. Either spring's assault on Sa'ib's garden would be an assault of colorlessness, on what is already colorful, or an assault of colors it doesn't need because it is already colorful. Either way, the colors of the Garden of Sa'ib's poetry are not seasonal or natural ones. Echoing one of the oldest conceptions of the work of literature in Persian, perhaps most famously formulated in Sa'di's presentation in 1258 of his book, The Rose Garden of Gulistan, as an artificial and thus immortal rose garden of eternal spring, Sa'ib's rose garden of poetry is either his divan or that of his imagination. In either case, it is an imaginary garden whose aesthetics, like Marianne Moore's real toads and imaginary gardens, must be guarded from naturalistic interpretation. Erotic deprivation and material poverty provoke and protect imaginative creation. The next slide, please. So the next slide, the next verse goes like this. Grant me, can we have the next slide, please? Yeah. Grant me parrot-like, a writing board fashioned of the mirror-faced, dawn green, pistachio-like, my tongue soared with silence. Distich 3 seems to pray for speech instead of silence, but its ingenuity lies in its entwinement of two metaphors from distinct semantic fields, the polished surface, mirror or sword, clouded with green verdigris, and the green-beaked parrot. Sa'ib asks to be instructed in poetic speech through parrot-like imitation of the mirror-faced ones, that is, radiant Ghazal beloveds. But he also asks that his tongue's sword luster not be greened with silence, like a pistachio, whose physical resemblance to a parrot's beak he leaves to our imagination. Again, the poet has asked for a non-natural creativity. He wants to be parrot-like, but not a parrot, burnished or stripped away of all natural greenness, like the Byzantine mirror in the tale of Rumi's Masnavi, in the tale at the end of volume 1 of Rumi's Masnavi, of the painting competition between the Chinese and the Byzantines. Some of you may know that, right? So this is, in that sense, sort of a prayer for a non-natural springtime. Right? The next slide, please. Stick 4. Wherever I turn from the dust of your threshold, the tip of your curling lock twists at my reins. As if to underscore this preference for outward colorlessness, Distich 4 declares that wherever the poet faces after being burnished by the dust of his beloved's threshold, he finds himself reined in by his beloved's curl. The dust of devotion burnishes natural colors away till only the beloved's black hair tip remains. The image suggests a near identification of lover and beloved. One is a curling hair tip, the other a horse rein twisted by the curling hair tip. The next slide, please. Distich 5. I'm that colorful melodied bird from whom in every garden I may be in, they steal flowers from each other's hands for my nest. That's Distich 5. Distich 5 builds on the previous distich's assertion of ascetic blackness by presenting Sa'ib as that colorful melodied bird for whose nest people seize flowers from each other. Colorful sound, a synesthetic formulation that lets us infer that this is not natural color, but imaginary color, perhaps achieved by submission to the beloved's black hair tips. Such imaginary color, as song by an imaginary bird, provokes readers to pluck real flowers for its real nest, an inversion of Marianne Moore's imaginary gardens with real toads in them. Right? The next text, slide, please. When with such preening disdain you enter the solitude, khalwat, of my embrace, a beating in my bones drains them of marrow. All of this, Distich 6 suggests, by its indexical such or this, was the beloved's proud advent into the khalwat of the poet's embrace. Khalwat, a Sufi term of art, meaning solitary communing with the divine by both individual and group, here suggests that Sa'ib may well be alone in his intimacy with the beloved. The image in the second hemstick is of an erasure of the physical part of his self, in line with the earlier erasure of physical colors. His pulsing drains the marrow from his bones. But complementing its companion hemstick, it also suggests that it is the beloved who flows into the lover's hollowed bones. The next slide, please. Distich 7. You granted me steady fixity, grant me motion too. You tighten my stirrup, now loosen my reins. The penultimate distich retains this imagery of limbs, but turns on a tension between stillness and movement, praying for lightness of rein, R-E-I-N, rein, or speed. It reverts to the image in Distich 4 of the poet as a horse driven by the beloved. The next slide, please. Light-spiritedness won't enter like dawn breeze into the garden, that it might scatter my poetry, sahib, like petals at feet. The final distich builds on this image of lightness, but predicates it of spirit. Light-spiritedness won't enter the poet's imaginary garden like the dawn breeze. A negation continues with the foregoing elaboration of an imagined world as autonomous of natural laws. This is, as I'm sure those of you who know 19th century Urdu literature, the birth of Urdu literary criticism, would know this. This is important, right? Because this is let's say Mughal Safavids, the Mughal Safavid period's greatest poets, one of the greatest poets, Sahib, insisting on a non-verisimilar criterion of mimesis, or a model of mimesis that's not naturalistic, right? So, not entering this garden, such lightness of the poet's spirit will not scatter the flower petals of Sahib's poetry at feet as the breeze might. What then does such prayed for lightness of spirit accomplish? The distich does not say, but it lets us infer a suggestion. Sahib's utterances, the word bayan echoing its first appearance in the opening distich, will not be as easily mastered as petals at our feet. The sword of Sahib's tongue may be light-spirited, but will not be used for so easy a task as the scattering of petals. The ghazal that opened with the poet's prayer for subjection to cruel beloveds ends with his boast that the garden of his imagination affords only the difficult pleasures of non-natural flowers. This ghazal is, to speak anachronistically, a manifesto for the mannerist autonomy of the lyric imagination. Before Bedil composed, can we have the next slide, please? Before Bedil composed his ghazal in response to this one, Shaukat Bukhara and Shaukat Bukharai and Nasir Ali of Sirhind composed their own, which appear in Bedil's ghazal chain. As Bedil's response ghazal takes Sa'ib, Shaukat, and Nasir Ali's ghazals into account, here is Shaukat's ghazal. Right. Could we have the next slide, please? The next one. Yeah. So it's the same meter. خدایا رنگ تأثیری کرامت کن زبانم را به موج اشک بلبل آب ده تیگ زبانم را. You'll also recognize the repetition of Sa'ib's radif or refrain. Grant, O Lord, the shade of effectivity to my tongue. Grant by the wave of the nightingale's tears, luster to my tongue's sword. Shaukat opens the end phrase of Sa'ib's opening distich and replicates its theme, mazmoon of a prayer to God to grant his poetry acceptance. But where Sa'ib prays that the sword of his utterance, Tika Bayan, may be granted luster, or by venom from the eyes of the beautiful, Shaukat prays that the sword of his utterance be granted the same luster by the wave of the nightingale's tears. What was proud confrontation between poet lover and beloveds in Sa'ib is the poet's sympathetic identification with the lover in Shaukat. The next slide, please. Okay, I'll just keep reading in the interest of time. So much does the frailty or doubling of black fortune weaken my body. The next one, please. No, it was the previous one. The previous slide. Yeah. So much does the frailty doubling of black fortune weaken my body that the Huma's eye imagines my bones to be eyelashes. Shaukat repeats Sa'ib's end phrase, but hyperbolically develops Sa'ib's theme of the speaker's bodily thinness as a source of poetic power. The Sufi theme of frail power. It goes back at least to Attar. The Huma is a fabulous bird from the Persian literary universe which feeds on bones and portends kingship on whoever it casts its shadow. Here, the Huma doesn't only portend Shaukat's poetic kingship, but goes further by taking his bones for eyelashes, perhaps its own. The blackness of Shaukat's fortune echoes the blackness of his eyelashes, as well as displacing the blackness of the beloved's curling hair tip in Sa'ib's ghazal onto the lover here. But there may be an irony here because the word zaf or frailty is orthographically and metrically identical to zaif, doubling, right? You can vocalize them in either way in the Persian script, right? If black fortune weakens Shaukat's body by doubling or splitting it into two, then the Huma imagines his bones to be eyelashes because it is squint-eyed, because Shaukat's frail power tricks it into bestowing kingship on him. The next slide, please. Distich 3. I hope for the fragrance of a wound from the heatless rose, for it imagines my lamentation to be the sound of colors draining or the defeat of colors. Right? Shaukat replicates the synesthesia and masochism of Sa'ib's ghazal. Here, Shaukat is implicitly a nightingale whose melancholy song the rose takes for shikaste rang, a phrase that means both colorlessness and the defeat of color. Because the rose takes Shaukat's song for colorlessness, Shaukat hopes it will wound him into color. But this color, unlike Sahib's imaginary garden of flowers of non-natural colors, will be a fragrance. What was imaginary color in Sahib is fragrant color in Shaukat. The next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. By my envy, the rose's vein resembles a cindered hair. Sweepings of the nightingale's eyelashes remain for my nest. Shaukat repeats Sahib's end phrase, but inverts Sahib's boast of being a bird of colorful song by saying that he has a nest of the nightingale's eyelashes because his envy has burned the rose's vein like a cindered hair and implicitly also burned the nightingale. Where Sahib's boast had color, Shaukat only has blackness, or blackness again. The next slide, please. Right. My plant has steeped in water from the stream of a fiery poetic nature. Shaukat, press my autumn leaves and the springtime drips out. Shaukat's final distich synthesizes the vernal and autumnal metaphors of Sahib's second and last distichs, respectively, to build, Mazmun Afrini, to build on Sahib's idea of poetry as an artificial plant. If Sahib's rose garden of poetry is wintry or spring immune, Shaukat's plant is watered by his fiery temper such that its autumnal leaves drip spring if pressed. Shaukat is one possible resolution of what begins in Sahib's Ghazal as the notion that lyric or imaginary reality must emancipate itself from natural reality. But as the foregrounding of darkness and tears suggests, this is a melancholy lyric independence. Nasr Ali, next slide please. Nasr Ali Sirhindi's response Ghazal, only 3 distichs long, is the briefest in the chain. Could we have the next slide please? Nasr Ali was a contemporary from Punjab, although lived in Delhi, of Bedil. Also a significant Sufi poet in Ibn Arabi's tradition. So, could we have the next slide, please? This is taking long. Okay. I'll read out the first distich in the original to show you the meter again. Ilahi shukhi barke tajalli de zabanam ra qabul khatir Musa kalaman kon bayanam. This is the third distich. I want the first one. It's 2 previous slides. It's slide 16. You're on 19. All right. I'm just going to keep reading. This is not the slide that illustrates it. Anyway, the refrain of his opening prayer echoes the opening of Sahib's Ghazal as well as that of Shaukat, and as we will see, Bedil's response Ghazals. Zaban Amra, to my tongue. As in Sahib and Shaukat's openings, Nasr Ali's metaphor for divinely inspired poetic speech is visual. But where Sahib and Shaukat's tongues are swords, whetted by beloved's venom and lover's tears, Nasr Ali's is the lightning of theophany. Where Sahib had sought a share in the approbation of hearts, Qabul Dil, in general, Nasr Ali seeks to please the minds, Qabul Khatir, of those of Mosaic commandments, Musa Kalaman, right? That is prophetic lawgivers. This is a restriction of address to a spiritual elect. The next slide, please. Yeah. Into the night chamber of nothingness, I bore the image of that fairy-faced one that don't like it might render my bones the rising sun. The second distich replicates Sahib and Shaukat's image of the self-contained imagination. The lover speaker contains his beloved as an image of that fairy-faced one and carries it into the night chamber of nothingness of Adam, a word connoting the nothingness that preceded creation. Nasr Ali imitates God, who contained creation in himself as an idea. By Persian poetic convention, fairies or paris are luminous beings you can hold in bottles. Nasr Ali holds one as a khayal, a spectre of the mind. The scene is vivid. The poet withdraws into primordial darkness with a diaphanous idea so that his bones, recalling Sahib's beloved-filled bones and Shaukat's eyelash-thin ones, might be rendered dawn's molten rising. The next slide, please. This is the next slide is the final distich in Nasr Ali's Ghazal response. Yeah. I leap into his lane like lightning into the embrace of restlessness or helplessness in that hour when his ardor snatches the reins from my hand. The ghazal ends without Nasr Ali taking his own pen name, suggesting that he left it incomplete, but the last distich does echo Sahib's penultimate one by its image of the poet as a horse driven helplessly by his ardor for the beloved. But where Sahib speaks in imperatives to his God to loosen his reins that Sahib might gallop forth, Nasser Ali collapses such difference between self and other. He is intimate with his beloved like lightning in the embrace of restlessness or helplessness. Betabi literally also means without heat or radiance, and thus faint, suggesting a fading away of self into other at just that moment when ardor seizes his reins. Given how apt it is that he should fall silent here, namelessly, perhaps the ghazal is complete after all. How did Bedil respond to Sa'ib and to Shaukat and Nasir Ali's responses to Sa'ib? Here is Bedil's opening distich. So the next slide, please. Yeah, I'll read out the original first couplet, right? سوار برق عمرم نیست برگشتن اینانم را مگر نام تو گیرم تا بگرداند زبانم را. Mounted on life's lightning, there is no riding back, unless I take your name that it might transform my tongue. Like the opening verses of in his models, Bedil's opening verse ends with the refrain, to my tongue, Zaban Amra, and is a visual image of his own poetic agency. Whereas Sa'ib and Shaukat speak in tongues that are swords, and Nasir Ali prays the splendor of theophany's lightning might land on his tongue. Bedil's tongue or language is lightning itself. Furthermore, in the first hemstick, it is a horse he rides but cannot control. As in the Arabic poetry of Abu Nuwas, present circa 814, one of the great Abbasid poets, where we see what James Montgomery calls, quote, an equation of equine power, lightning, and water, unquote. We see an equation here of Bedil's tongue, lightning, and equine power. None of these under his control. And yet, this is a prayer and thus assumes agency of some sort. For the second hemstick qualifies this despair by the possibility of taking the addressee's name and thus transforming or turning around, big Adnan, that means both, Bedil's tongue. This is an idea of prayer familiar to Persian Sufism from Attar's Manterote, or Conference of the Birds, great 12th century Sufi allegory, whose hupo urges his birds or his followers to pray for God's favors, even as he asserts that at the same time, this isn't Dick Davis's translation, no one can gain this by forms of prayer, unquote. This contradiction leads the hupo to advise them to pray in despair. In Attar's Sufi allegory, as in this distich by Bedil, prayer is a peculiar kind of action that does not assume that its object or aim will be attained, and yet creates the psychological condition, despairing request, for its remotely possible attainment. In this sense, prayer is a duty with the weakest possible causality, whose effects, in the unlikely event there are any, are prodigious. The rest of the ghazal is a series of reformulations of this basic idea, that Bedil's poetry as a whole is the unlikely burgeoning forth of effects from an abject authorial cause. As he says in another ghazal elsewhere, quote, manifest in the ant's batting eyes at the opening and closing of Solomon's doors. It's a rather gorgeous Baroque formulation of the same idea. Note the reuse of refrains or radifs from a ghazal or ghazals in the same meter, rhyme and refrain, the zamin, as well as from other ghazals, and the amplification of their connotative range by juxtaposition with new refrains. This is especially the case with Sa'ib, whose ghazals initiate the most number of ghazal chains in Bedil's Bayaz or notebook. Here, the reuse of, in addition to, refrains in his models builds up an echo chamber of imagery connoting hollowness. The refrain of the final distich, repeating that of the first, suggesting that this ghazal circles back upon itself like a tongue in the mouth's hollow. His tongue curls in the articulation of his addressee's name, working his reins, in Amra, horse reins, to restrain his life's horse, a metaphor of restrained wildness he circles back to in the penultimate distich, a structural circularity replicating the thematic one of hollowness. The next slide, please. Distich 2, yeah, thank you. I bear the quality of non-existence, the distinction of a footprint, struck now that you might find my sign underfoot. He is nothing but a hollow of a sign, Nishan, imprinted in the earth by the hooves of his addressee's prancing horse, a hyperbolic elaboration of Sa'ib's hollow-boned poet, the poet's eyelash-thin bones in Shaukat, and the poet with non-molten bones in Nasir Ali. Right? He's compressed all three models into this distich. The next slide, please. If candle-like ardor for you were to assay my power, the fading/flight of colors from my marrow would drain my bones hollow. Repeating a refrain in Sa'ib, Shaukat and Nasir Ali, the declaration here is that if ardor for the addressee tests him, his colors would fade or fly upward. Parvaz Rang means both, like those of a candle flame, draining his bones. Ustakhan Amra, hollow. Next slide, please. Not even in death do I cease to speak in praise of your strutting. No seizure of apoplectic silence snatches at my poetry's flowing skirt hem. Extending the equestrian metaphor for poetry in his models, his mouth opens even in death to extol his addressee's prancing, keeping the resonant hollow of his billowing skirt from the seizure of apoplectic silence. Sakte. Sakte also means metrical imbalance. Right? The next slide, please. I sell dust in the bustling heart of the bazaar of illusions. God forbid that blinking should board up my shop. Adding a metaphor absent in his models, Bedil stays unblinking in his sale of dust in the bazaar of illusions, lest blinking board up his shop into a dark hollow. There is a hollow implicit here. The next slide, please. By no other stratagem may the target be sought, unless the heart's breaking wave-like strings my bow. Another metaphor new to this Ghazal chain: heartbrokenness strings his bow like a wave, bending it into a hollow, tense with the arrow aimed at his target. The next slide, please. Don't seek, O poverty, humiliating or erroneous submission of ones as abject as myself. How long will the earth grind my sky underfoot? He commands poverty not to seek the abject prostration or erroneousness. Zillat means both abjection and error, right? Of ones as base as himself. How much longer, the second hemstick asks rhetorically, will the earth or prosodic patterns, I mean means both, grind his sky down? His poetry is, we infer, a celestial hollow constrained by lyric imitation to terrestrial depths. Next slide, please. For shame of security, why query the forlornness of my striving? Sweat won't seek my shores outside this ocean. Ashamed at his own security and sweating by poetic convention from shame, he finds his poetic striving is disappointed or forbidden. Mahrumi means both, right? Building on the image of the terrifying ocean in Hafiz's metapoetic first ghazal, he is adrift in the ocean of his sweat, which does not seek shores, Karan, for him outside of itself. The associative chain is apparent. The shame of futile poetic striving produces an ocean of sweat, which is itself poetry, whose shores lie within the ocean, a hollow that remains hollow and yet filled up. Next slide, please. For heartache in this desert, I packed no bags of hope. The camel bell rang out, setting on fire my caravan's merchandise. Citing Hafiz's first ghazal again, this distich evokes the desert journey of the classical Arabic panegyric, but where the camel bell urges the speaker past the beloved's encampment in Hafiz, it sets fire here to the speaker's merchandise of poetry, evoking another famous image from another ghazal by Hafiz, where the ray of the beloved's beauty in pre-eternity begets love and sets the world on fire. The absence of hope's baggage, the bell's hollow, and the burned caravan, all hollows, evoking Hafiz's images of inspiration by primordial calamities. The next slide, please. Where might I wail for the oppressiveness of a heavy heart? Not a sound from the shoulder that would lift my sighing. The image of the inaudibility of a shoulder to lift a sigh or lamentation builds on the synesthesia that runs through Sa'ib, Shaukat, and Nasr Ali. The distich turns on the contrast between the protuberance of an absent shoulder and the heavy sigh. Again, a heaviness of words that settles into a hollow. Next slide, please. Yeah. The dripping of the traces of bounty too is temporary. May such extravagance not abash my giver of daily bread. We see an extension of this contrast here. The dripping of the divine benefactor's bounty is temporary, mawqi'i, right? May such extravagance not abash the benefactor, the speaker says, turning what is implicitly generosity's due to what is implicitly shame sweat. Where his models had single body fluids, Bedil contrasts two. The sapfulness of dew, signaled in the partial pun on rasonam, ras and rasonam, to the hollowness of sweat. Right? The next slide, please. Candle-like, one night, I started or ended a concealed talk of love's melting. A sucking from each limb's lips planted a kiss on my mouth. This is perhaps the most complex of the discs. I'll read out the original. Shabi chun sham harfi az godaz ishq sar kardam makidan az labe har oz busizad dahanam. A sucking from every limb's mouth kissed his mouth. Dahanam. When one night, like a candle flame, he began sar kardam. But sar kardam also means ended or concealed. Right? Talk of love's melting. Did the kissing begin or end his talk or conceal it while blocking his mouth? The pun and the syntax allow for all three possibilities. In all three, the love lyric originates or ends or hides in the hollow of mouths joined in a kiss. Next slide, please. I was a breath hopping mad on the desert of signless galloping. The heart turning mirror finally seized my reins. Circling back to this ghazal's opening, the hemstick, and to Sa'ib's third distich, which speaks of the mirror-faced, Oine Rukhsaran, and entwining it with the equestrian metaphor running through Bedil's models, this distich overturns Sa'ib's poetic confidence into poetic despair. Where the mirror-faced tutored Sa'ib in poetry like a parrot, the heart's mirror clouds over with the speaker's heavy breathing as he goes hopping mad, Junun Payma, across a desert of traceless galloping. That this should be the penultimate distich is fitting because a mirror was conventionally held over the mouths of the dying to test if their breaths gave evidence of life by fogging it, at least in poetic convention, perhaps in reality too. Right? Structurally and metaphorically, then, this distich is a dying exhalation turned upon itself, a kind of hollowness. The next slide, please. Of the mysteries of a mouth, I set down a few words, accepting the distant black silhouette slash body slash person of non-existence who understands my language. Echoing the refrain of the Ghazal's opening distich, this distich characterizes the foregoing poem as nothing but a few words. Halfi Chand, right? Half Chandi, sorry. Set down, in shore, of the mysteries of the beloved's conventionally tiny mouth. Nobody but the distant black silhouette, shakhs, or body, shakhs, or person, shakhs means all three, of non-existence understands his speech, Zaban Amro. His tongue curls upon itself as only the calligraphed beloved of the lyric, metonymically captured here by the conventionally dot-small mouth of the beloved, understands him. Is this a formulation of authorial despair or independence? I'd say it's both. For the rationale or mazmoon at work in all in these 14 formulations of lyrically productive hollowness, greater number than their models, as well as lexically denser and metaphorically more mixed than them, is that of kenosis. Kenosis, an originally Christian theological concept, here generalized to formulate the empirical self's voiding of itself to let a greater self take its place, is Bedil's most pervasive way of formulating his own authorship. It frequently appears in the final or signature distichs of his ghazals. When it concludes his ghazals in response to others in his notebook, in his bayaz, it typically overturns the optimism and poetic boasting of his models, as in his response to Sa'ib and Urfi's responses to Hafiz's first ghazal, into despairing poetic success. Bedil is the hollow reed flute of the opening of Rumi's Masnavi, ventriloquizing for the fire of cosmogonic love. He's also the subject of Fariduddin Attar's injunctions across his oeuvre to pray in despair. But he's also arguably, and this is where I want to suggest something perhaps more arguable, right? He's also the jiva or individual self of Advaita Vedanta who realizes his identity with Brahman, the one reality underlying phenomenal multiplicity. Did Sanskrit and vernacular Hindu monism serve as an impetus to Bedil's radicalization of Sufi kenosis? If so, he wasn't alone in his early modern Hindustani milieu, for, as Michael Allen and Monica Hostman have argued, his Sant contemporaries, vernacular saint contemporaries, also inhabited Sufi, Bhakti, and Advaitic identities at once. Also noteworthy is that Bedil's kenotic formulations typically take the form of contrasts, oppositions, and paradoxes. The ant Solomonic power, the loud silence of reeds, the blackness of light, whales in deserts and leopards in oceans, shores leaping out of oceans, and so forth. Readable as, can we have the next slide, please? Readable as elaborations of older kenotic themes in Persian Sufi imagination, these lyric formulations of powerful frailty would also have recalled to scores of his Hindustani readers the Ulat Bamsi, or so-called upside-down or inverted language of vernacular sant or saint poets. In other words, I do want to say that one doesn't have to. This is a kind of duck or rabbit kind of situation where if you don't know the Ulat Bamsi or you don't know Kabir, you wouldn't need to know it for the poem to be intelligible. You could read it entirely in Sufi terms, Persianate Sufi terms, and it would be intelligible. But if you did know it, you would see it, right? You either see the duck or you see the duck and rabbit at once or independently, depending on whether you are able to see it, right? So this is a translation. This is Linda Hess's translation of Kabir. Just an example, a well-known example of Ulat Bamsi. In the middle of the sky's temple blooms a flower. Its petals are down and its roots are up. No tilling, sowing, or watering, no shoots or leaves, just a flower. Right? But whereas Sant poetry drew its imagery from antinomian tantric conversions of the human body from an impediment to liberation into a means to it, Bedil's imagery derives almost exclusively from the Persian Ghazal tradition. So can we have the next slide, please? These are just two instances of sort of upside-down imagery, but the imagery is drawn entirely from the Persian Ghazal tradition. He couldn't have drawn on the imagery of vernacular Sant poetry and yet remained intelligible as a Persian poet. It was the Masnavi genre that allowed him this liberty, letting him, for example, illustrate a Rumi-like Neoplatonic cosmogony with the Yoga Vashishta mediated Hatha Yogic Tantric images of the circulation of knowledge as breath, prana in Sanskrit, nafas in Persian, in the subtle body, and of its highest chakra symbolized by the 1,000-petal lotus, Sahasrara in Sanskrit, and Gule-Hizar Rang in Persian, in his Masnavi Irfan of 1712. Right? In this sense, the parallels in the ghazals are structural, not imagistic. You see them only if you already know the upside-down language of vernacular Hindavi. If you don't, you see only his collapsings of binary opposites, familiar from the Persian poetic tradition. Either way, the effect is to imply a coincidence of opposites that, by releasing the reader from a will to power, might let a greater power occupy him. To many of his students who were familiar with the Tantrism of North India's vernacular Sant poets, Bedil's mixing of metaphors from different senses, facilitated by his pervasive preference for the eightfold forms of meters, would have been recognizable. Where a distic by Sa'ib or Shokat might work with a visual metaphor only, Bedil's one or two or three distichs containing that visual metaphor will entwine it with an olfactory or auditory one, implying that what is true in that sensory mode is simultaneously true in others. The upshot is the pervasive impression one gets in Bedil's ghazals that the human sensorium as a whole, as in the body affirming tantric tale of the crow Bhushanda in the Persian translation we know Bedil read of the Yoga Vashishta, is a site for ontological disclosures. Furthermore, to the extent that Bedil may be said to have had a style even of this densely textured, intertextual poetic culture, its most salient feature is his invention of nominal compounds. Here are a few examples. Adam Kayfiyat, qualified by non-existent. Dashte bi nishan tazi, the desert of traceless galloping, are cases of this from this ghazal. Elsewhere across his oeuvre, for example, I've drawn almost randomly. You see them everywhere across his oeuvre. Here are a few examples of nominal compounds that would recall Sanskrit and Hindi. Tahqiq shobhe unvan, distinguished by inquiry into doubt or doubt-seeming inquiry. Agle aghahi darajat, reason with multi-leveled awareness. Afsune adze yas sabab, the spell of incapacity caused by despair. Kalam harze furush, prattle vending words. Dabistane bi khudi tamheed, a school offering tuitions in selflessness. Ilm vahmandish, illusion imagining knowledge. To several of his readers familiar with Sanskrit and Hindi, these would have seemed like Persian imitations of the nominal compounding normal in those languages, even as they sounded strange in Persian. His predilection for extended uses of the izofe, the Persian genitive or adjectival marker, minimized the use of prepositions. What is a preposition in any language but specification of the mode of relation between thought and object or object and object? To minimize the use of prepositions is to imply a collapsing of thought and its object or object and object. The combined effect is to inscribe Ibn Arabi's monism into his very syntax, even as his lexical compounds mimicked Sanskritic ones in his multilingual milieu. Together, these invocations and violations of lexemic and syntactic horizons of expectation in Persian came to serve as resources for Ghalib, India's last Urdu Persian poet in the classical mode, at least so canonized as such. Fortifying this claim to a lexical syntactic bisemi are the 60 ghazals Bedil composed in the eightfold and sound Kamil meter, right? The Kamil Musammane Salim, right? Which is a meter extremely infrequent in Persian, though of great antiquity and common currency in Arabic. Whereas modern Persian prosodists have remarked on the unusualness of this accomplishment, they have failed to explain it except as a sign of Bedil's willful novelty. But the fact that it was not altogether unknown in Persian, and through its use in some of the mu'allaqat, or the so-called hanging odes of 6th, 7th century Arabic, connoted antiquity, complements Bedil's claims across his autobiography that he drew his inspiration not from the canonical poets of the genre he was writing in, but from the pre-eternal emanation of Fairs. This is a neoclassical posture that he shares with Azad Bilgrami in his time and that Ghalib will later inherit in his own Persian. So could we have the next slide, please? I'll read out... well, I have to read out from here. Right, so this is a classic example from the from the 7th century. On the eve of Islam, you have Michael Seltz's translation. I'll just read out the Arabic to give you a sense of the rhythm. Afatid diyaru mahalluha. One second, I'm just gonna. I wish I had it right here. Or larger. Anyway, أفتد ديار محلها فمقامها بمنن تعبد غولها فرجانها فمدافع الريان يري رسمها خلقا كما ذامن الوه يسلامها. Right, that rhythm is one that's common enough in Arabic already in the 7th century, early 7th century, but that remains common in Arabic, but is extremely infrequent in Persian. But the eightfold sound Kamil would also have been intelligible to Bedil's Hindustani readers as identical with the Sanskrit and Hindi meter Harigitika. Could we have the next slide, please? Suggesting that he wanted to exploit the possibility of prosodic echoes across ambient languages. Professor Philip Ludgendorff showed me how the Harigitika features in Tulsidasa's Ramcharitmanas, or the sacred lake of Rama's deeds, North India's most famous vernacular telling of Rama's story in Bedil's time, as in ours, at moments of heightened emotional and devotional intensity. He observed how the opening line of Harigitika verse in Tulsi's epic will recapitulate the foregoing action in its opening line and dwell on it with descriptive intensity. So this is not from the Tulsi Manas, but it's from it's actually I got this from Apte's prosody, illustration. It's an example. Perhaps he wrote it, perhaps. But anyway, it's the same meter as you'll see from the Arabic, except that it's corresponds to the eightfold form of the Arabic, right? Karatala chanchala kankana swana mishranena manora mara maniya venu ninadarang Niradarangima sangamena sukhavaha. So you see it's the same meter as the Arabic. Right. So if could we have the next slide, please? You'll see that you'll see how Tulsi uses it. Bhare bhuvana ghora kathora rava ravi baji taji maragu chale chikkarahi diggajadola mahi ahi kola kuruma kalmale, and so forth. Right. So that is the Avadhi, and take a look now at Bedil's use of the same meter. Could we have the next slide, please? Yeah. که کشید دامن فطرتت که به سیر ما و من آمدی تو بهار عالم دیگری ز کجا به این چمن آمدی. Right? It's the same meter again. Bedil's choice of this meter allows him, as you see even in these few distichs, to develop the I-thou relationship pervasive to his poetry in syntactically complex and metaphorically denser ways. The two long syllables in each foot of 5 syllables allow him unusually frequent use of attached pronouns. And the refrain in this ghazal unites the ghazal thematically around a theme familiar from Rumi's Divan, namely Divan-e-Shams, namely the wondrous advent of a divine other into the speaker's world. Finally, let me briefly consider the effects of the choice of meter in one of his only 2 ghazals, in the eightfold and doubled mutadarik, which is equally rare in Persian. In fact, rare to the point of being non-existent. Right? Bedil almost invents this. Right? So let's have the next slide, please. Right? So, yeah. نیم آن که به جرأت وصف لبت رسدن خم و پیچ اینان ادب ز تأمل موج گوهر زده ام در حسن ادا به زبان ادب. So could we have the next slide, please? Yeah, I'll read, and one more, one slide further, please. Yeah. And one more slide, please. There we go. So look at this. Look at the Sanskrit. The sort of the exact correspondence with the Totaka in Sanskrit. Kamala kuchachu chuka kunkamato niyataru nitatula nilatano kamalayata lochana lokapate vijayi bhava venkata shailapate. It's identical, right? The signature distinct suggests that Bedil, if you go back, please, just go back a slide or two. This is it. No, hang on. One more. I'm trying to find the signature listing, sorry. Further, one down, please. Sorry about this. And one more down, or is that next one Sanskrit? One more down, please. That's it. ز ترانه ی حیرت بیدل من به چه نغمه تپد رگ ساز سخن که تری شکند دم عرض نفس پر و بال خدنگ کمان ادب. So, where he says, to what song does the vein of poetry's lute throb at the melody of my Bedil's bewilderment, or the bewilderment of my lost heart? He's punning on his own pen name. For shame, sweat breaks out at the breath sword from the arrow feathers of the bow of decorum. This distich suggests that Bedil is signaling his awareness of the strangeness of his own meter in his ghazal, and as it were explains it as a musical dissonance between Bedil's uncontrollably ardent song and its decorous poetic prosodic instrument. Notice that the Radif has adab in it, right? How might this ghazal's formulations of tension between ardor for his addressee and metrical restraint have sounded to a reader accustomed to Sanskrit and Hindavi hymnal prosody? Right? Consider this famous hymn in the same meter, which is called Totaka, and I read out the Hindavi to you. But take a look finally at, could we go further down, please? How Tulsidas used the same. Further down. Yes. Jaya Rama Sada Sukha Dhama Hare Raghunaya Kasaya Kachapa Dhare Bhavabara Nadarana Simha Prabhu Gunasagar Nagar Natha Vibho. This is certainly a meter that Bedil would have known through Avadhi or Hindavi, if not directly from Sanskrit, right? Consider where this particular verse appears in Tulsi's epic. Consider that the crux of Brahma's eulogy is the contrast between the selfishness of the voluptuary gods and Rama's disinterested intervention. At this point in the narrative, in the Manas, the shift to the Totaka complements the heightened devotional intensity of Brahma's prayer for virtuous authenticity. Given that Bedil's ghazal turns on the tension between decorum, adab, and ardor, does this choice of meter not evoke Brahma's prayer to a bilingual listener? Right? I began this talk by asking what models does the pre-colonial ghazal offer us for a reimagination of the lyric subject, Bedil's lyric corpus allows us to propose that early modern ghazal practices participated in a multilingual autonomization of the imagination across the Persianate world, and that this autonomization in Bedil's case was his Akbarian or Ibn Arabi informed Islamic monist appropriation of the Hindu Advaitic or non-dualist doctrine, mediated to him in Persian translations of the Sanskrit philosophical work Yoga Vashishta and in Hindavi, that the phenomenal world is an imaginary projection of the individual consciousness, and that the individual self is identical with the trans-individual Brahman or its Sufi equivalent. We may also propose that the binary opposites in Bedil's Ghazal imagery imitated the structure, if not the substance, of the Hindu-Muslim syncretism of Hindavi Sant poets, that he appropriated into his Ghazal imagery only those Advaitic motifs that coincided with pre-existing Persian ones, for example, Nafas Doz Didan, the Hatha Yogic stilling of the life breath, Beze Tawus, the peacock's egg, which correspond to the grammarian philosopher Bhartrihari's peacock egg metaphor for how the coruscating many issued from the colorless one. And that Bedil invented the possibility in the Persian ghazal of being rhythmically intelligible as a Persian and Sanskritic poet at once. And that by these features, he invented the possibility, as his younger contemporary and Persian poet Lakshminarayan Shafiq recognized, of speaking in the ghazal as a Hindu and Muslim monist at once. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Prashant. Thank you very much. Before we start with the question answer session, let me apologize to the viewers as well as to Prashant that today we had a number of glitches. Unfortunately, technology is something which is beyond possibly Prashant and beyond me. And I mean, I used to think that Shagufta can handle it well, but she also sometimes fails in front of the technological issues which arise. So there were some issues in the slides, but at the end of it all, we were able to hear Prashant Keshavmurthy, and I think the slides were also ultimately visible to one and all. With this apology, let me start with the question answer session. There are a number of questions which have been put up. Mirza Hasnan has a very basic question. What was Bedil's influence on Allama Iqbal? Did he quote him in some of his works of poetry?
He does quote him, but to be perfectly honest, I've had this question before when I presented this talk elsewhere, but recently I'm rather ignorant of Iqbal, I should say upfront. So I wouldn't presume to answer this question with any authority. And I know that Iqbal invokes Bedil at various points, but to with what degree of awareness of specifically my argument, as in of his Bisemic sort of poetics, I don't really know. I don't get the sense that Iqbal is aware of Bedil's specific uses of Advaita, for example, in his Masnavis, and then his sort of implicit uses of it in his ghazals. That's my sense anyway. So. But I'm no authority on Iqbal. So. What was the Bedil's poetry on Ghalib? Bilal Malik asking. Certainly, one major influence was stylistic. This sort of syntactic density and the extended uses of the izafa to produce these nominal compounds, which I'm suggesting would have been recognizable as Indic or Sanskritic to many of his bilingual many of the poets. He mentored a whole group of Hindu poets who wrote, and Muslim poets too, who wrote both in Braj Bhasha, Abdhi, or let's say Hindavi, as well as Persian. And they would certainly have, it's hard to believe that they wouldn't have, that this this sort of compounding, lexical compounding by the extended use of the izafa would not have invoked the nominal compounds of Braj, Abdhi, and Sanskrit to them, right? So that's an explicit kind of influence, stylistic influence.
Ali Haider asks, as Bedil lived during the reign of Emperor Aurangzeb, his lifespan was from 1642 to 1720. Do we find any mention of Aurangzeb in his poetry, or any mention of later Mughals in their prime minister or their prime ministers?
Well, not Aurangzeb directly. Aurangzeb himself mentions Bedil in one of his letters. He quotes a couplet by Bedil to one of his sons. But Bedil himself doesn't, he famously refers to Farrukh Siyar and he apparently fled Delhi for that reason. But because he enraged the emperor. But rather the brothers, actually, the Sadat, the Sayyids of Badha, so who he enraged. But at any rate, a direct mention of Aurangzeb, I don't know of any in his work. There is a mention of Farrukhsiyar, but there is this Bedil's sort of rich correspondence with the governors of Delhi who were close to Aurangzeb, right? And his sons, right, who patronized Bedil and found him a bungalow. In fact, Bedil lived Bedil's bungalow, I figured, would have been at Rajghat, where Gandhi lies buried today, or his ashes lie interred today, shall we say. That's where it would have been located. So,
well, the question, David Sheffiz has been asking for your slides.
I can, yeah, I don't know this gentleman. I'm happy to send them to him. Yeah, you can email me, send them to you.
Prashant, the questions which arose, for example, in my mind, I am really thankful to you the way you explained the influence on Bedil, influence of the Indian traditions as well as the Persian traditions, as you were talking about. Are there any other contemporary poets of the 18th century where you find similar content as one finds in the poetry of Bedil? Are there any other examples, or is Bedil unique in this?
Yeah, that's something I've thought about. I think one sees in the Masnavi genre, because Masnavi has traditionally always been open to, even from the Shahnameh onwards, right, to all kinds of non-Islamic plots, right, or pre-Islamic and non-Islamic plots. One sees Shamsuddin Faqir, for example, Bedil's contemporary, who's otherwise well known for his work on Balaghat, right, in Persian Balaghat. But he has Dastan-e Ramchand, Tasveer-e Muhabbat, right? But it's the Indic element there is the plot. It's not per se philosophy or ideas. I don't. So as far as I know, Bedil may be the only Ghazal poet who certainly at the level of prosody invokes Indic meters by modifying extant poetic meters, Persian poetic meters, to make them replicate Sanskritic meters. Right? I don't know of any other poet who does that. Nor do these sort of this kind of prosodic adventurousness. Nor does it feature in Abul Hasan Najafi's very authoritative survey of Persian prosody. Najafi's book is one of the two major surveys of the history of Persian prosody, and he catalogs examples from down the centuries. When it comes to Kamil, the eightfold Kamil, or the Mutadarik, only Bedil features there, right? I mean, and he's given how what a great scholar Najafi was. He died recently. It's hard to believe that Najafi would simply have missed other poets. It's possible, the 18th century is prolific in India in terms of Persian. So who knows? There may be, but I don't know of others. I think it may also be Bedil's particular location that accounts for these experiments. He was a Qadiri from Darashiko's circle, in a way, right? Kind of close. He was familiar with writings from Darashiko's circle. Was surrounded by, and was lived at a time when Braj had been raised to Mughal poetic prestige, courtly prestige. Was patronized by the prince, by Aurangzeb's son, what's his name? I forget, Muhammad Azam, I think, who was renowned as a poet in Braj, right? Not just Persian. Given all of that, it's not surprising that he had sort of a perfectly trained audience around him for these kinds of experiments. Whereas Nasir Ali did not, and nor did Shaukat Bukharai or Saib, or, it's arguable whether any of the others did. Certainly others in Bedil's circle, especially his students, Amanat Rai Amanat, for example, who composes what is perhaps the longest Persian version of the Dasham Skanda, the 10th book of the Bhagavata Purana, which is Krishna's life, basically. Right? Jalva-e-Zat is what he calls it, Jilva-e-Zat. It's a long Masnavi, almost twice the length of Bedil's Irfan. Stefano Pello has written a wonderful essay on it. Now, someone like that would clearly have drawn on, imitated many of these procedures, many of these stylistic possibilities, these bisemic possibilities, right? Indic and Islamic at once, that Bedil, but I think I really get the sense that Bedil is an inaugurator and is unparalleled in his own time, except by his own students. So.
Right, right. I mean, the way you explained, I mean, the positioning of Bedil, I mean, he belongs to the camp of Dara Shikoh. I mean, and he is in contact with a number of people who are all antagonistic to Aurangzeb. So it is but natural that he doesn't mention Aurangzeb at all in his
Mhm.
writings, although, I mean, a part of his life passes through his reign.
Mhm.
He survives him and survives him by, say, around 15 years or so. He keeps on living, but he never mentions.
Yeah.
But it is very interesting to note that Aurangzeb, in spite of the fact that Bedil belongs to the circle of Dara, he is mentioning him in his letters. So that is something which is quite interesting. I mean, I'm really thankful to you that you brought this up, because I was somehow unaware that Aurangzeb does mention Bedil in his accounts. Prashant, there is a question by David Shafez who says, "What is, I mean, uh, Bedil's position now in today's Iran? How is he received there?"
So the question I see is, how can we explain the low profile Bedil enjoys
Yeah,
in
yeah.
Iran today? I mean, I think he had a low profile for quite a while, but it's changed now because of partly because of the sheer number of Afghan scholars based in Iran who are writing on Bedil, but also because of Iran's most famous literary critic, Shafiq Katkani, Mohammad Reza Shafiq Katkani, who wrote this rather well-known book called Shair-e Ainaha, The Poet of Mirrors, which is a study of Bedil. It's not entirely a kind of commendatory study of Bedil, but it's a study of Bedil. And Bedil's star seems to be rising in many ways, in Iran as well. But yeah, how to explain? I think he fell victim in a way to the Bozgashta Adabi, the literary return movement, which was a kind of Qajar period neoclassicism, moment of neoclassicism, which called for a stylistic return to what were taken to be the old masters like Sadi and so forth. So that's and this is not I'm not saying anything original here. This is arguably why Bedil fell out of favor in Iran by the early 19th century. Although, having said that, if you actually listen to the recordings of the radio program Golha, right, it's a famous Iranian radio program which recited and performed poetry, and you listen to what Iranian audiences were listening to on radio, in the 1950s and 60s, you actually see they were listening to lots of Bedil as well, among other poets. There was Bedil being recited and sung, among other poets, right? So it's not like he vanished. He may have fallen out of the canon, as it were, but he remained on radio, right? He remained part of a kind of popular culture, which is certainly worth remarking on. So.
Well, that reminds me, Prashant, that although, I mean, it's a little personal, but when I went to Tehran, and there were certain scholars out there, and there was an evening which we went to one of the famous Iranian poets, garden where his mausoleum was. And there, some of the poets, one of them said, "You are from Hind, India?" I said, "Yes." So he recited Bedil for me,
Uh-huh.
sitting there. Naturally, I couldn't understand it so well, but I mean, the way the Iranians were singing Bedil, I mean, to answer to Shafez, I would say that till date, I think even in today's Iran, Bedil has not been forgotten, possibly, perhaps, at
But
least by.
Mhm. Another reason may be beyond the conventional one that I gave you, which is that he was sidelined by a sort of nationalist neoclassicism emanating from the Qajar Code, which I think is not entirely adequate as an explanation. There's another reason, because it wasn't only Bedil who fell, but even Sa'ib, for example, was sidelined. He was from Iran. He was from Isfahan. He spent 7 years in India, otherwise was from Isfahan. He was very close to the Safavid court. I think, so the first part of my paper, where I traced what I call the autonomization of the lyric imagination, this particular Ghazal chain, which opens Bedil's Bayaz, what is the image of poetry we are left with? of the ghazal, which is the most prestigious genre standing in metonymically for all poetry, what is the image of the ghazal we're left with? The image we're left with, I'm arguing, is that what goes on in the world of the ghazal should not be judged by what goes on in natural life, in real life. I mean, it's sort of, the ghazal stands autonomous in its diegetic universe from ambient nature, physical nature certainly, but even social life, right? It's a kind of hermetically sealed off autonomous world through which you and I can interact with each other in terms of that world alone. We leave behind our social universes. Bedil himself had this phrase that he often uses across his works for, it's a word, it's a phrase, it's a kind of a phrase expressing contempt. He calls it, the phrase is man or more. Of course, literally it means I and we, but it's a signature Bedilian phrase for expressing a sort of petty involvement in everyday egotism and gossip and so forth, which is partly why he wouldn't have made mention of the Mughal court and its politics and so forth. He wasn't interested, right? He was emphatically interested only in metaphysics. And where he was drawn into questions of, social difference and so forth, he expressed contempt for it. So that you see that means that this particular ghazal tradition, sort of running from Urfi Shirazi, 16th century, Faizi, Kalima Kashani, Sahib Tabrizi, Shokat Bukharai, and Bedil, this particular tradition, because it insists on the autonomy of the imaginative universe of the ghazal, became sort of illegible to late 19th and 20th century reformist critics looking for social responsibility in poetry. How do you make poetry that insists on its lyric autonomy of society socially responsible? How do you insist? You basically condemn it for being autonomous, right? This is exactly what Azad and Hali do in a way with the ghazal. Right? There's a basic kind of inability to read the ghazal on its own terms, starting from the late 19th century in India and Iran.
Prashant, I mean, this is a subject on which I know very less. I'm sorry if I sound absurd to you. And there are three poets. For example, Urfi Shirazi, who comes to the court of Akbar.
Yeah.
He has a particular type of verses which he composes in Iran, and then when he comes to Akbar's court. Then we have Khan Arzu and his circle. In between, you have Bedil. I mean, can you talk about some trajectory starting from Urfi Shirazi down to in the 18th century Arzu's circle, and where would you place Bedil in all this?
So that's partly what I've tried to do, although Urfi didn't figure directly in this paper, but Urfi is part of among the poets who inaugurates a certain kind of lyric autonomy of the ghazal universe. This is nicely demonstrated if you compare, Anna Mary Schimmel has this nice essay which doesn't go far enough, but is a wonderful beginning, I think, in my opinion, where she compares a particular ghazal with the Radif Atashast, right? There is fire, which Urfi inaugurates, Sa'ib takes up, several other poets take up, and Bedil takes up twice in two of his ghazals, and then Ghalib takes up in his Persian Divan. And if you do the kind of exercise with that chain as I did for this chain today, I think the conclusion one would arrive at is similar to the conclusion I arrived at today, which is that there is an insistence on the superiority of the ghazal to other genres, but also the assimilation of the ghazal by the ghazal of all other genres into itself, and the autonomy of its lyric universe. And Khan Arzu is a kind of I think what he gives Safavid Mughal, late Safavid Mughal practice, poetic practice, is a critical vocabulary by which to defend this lyric autonomy. His two works, on syntax, poetic syntax and metaphor making, or bayan, ilme bayan and ilme ma'ani, Atiye Kubra and Mohibat Uzma, these two works are basically, they draw on Al-Taftazani, Taftazani's work on rhetoric, broadly to defend the autonomy of the imagination by trying to regulate elaborate metaphor making of the sort that Bedil is famous for, right? So
Yeah. Leher has been asking a question on the Sadate Baraha.
yeah,
Yeah.
there was no poetic influence at all. They were thugs, and Bedil ran away from them. That's it. There's nothing more to be said. So,
When uh, you know, uh, Arthur Dudney has, in fact, in one of his articles, I mean, which he has written on Sabake Hindi.
mhm.
I mean, a topic which you had picked up during the course of your talk, says that Sabake Hindi was neither developed in India nor it had something very specifically Indian about it. And anyone who could come from Iran and start getting court patronage, and he would be treated as one
Right,
of the poets
right.
uh, writing in Sabake Hindi. But contrary to what I had read in this article of Arthur Dedney, what you presented today with examples was something quite different, where you brought out, I mean, not only lyrics, but also, I mean, a lot of other things related with it, how the Indian tradition was influencing the ghazals and the poetics of Bedil. What would be your response to
So,
that
yeah,
question?
my response would be that I think Arthur's right, as is Rajiv Kinra. They both have argued persuasively that I mean, it's well known. You see, Sabke Hindi is a term that is normally associated with Malikushwara Bahar, right? Early 20th century Iranian poets
Mm-hmm.
who invented a kind of nationalist literary history by equating styles with regions, Sabke Khorasani, Sabke Hindi, Sabke Iraqi. Whereas, as Rajiv Kinra showed, there's nothing Hindi about Urfi Shirazi. I mean, if you told Urfi Shirazi, even Munir Lahori, writing in the 17th century, your style is Hindi, he would have said, "What are you talking about? I have no idea what you mean." Right? So this is a later projection of territorial nationalism onto stylistic debates, right? This idea of, in fact, the word sabk itself was not really used. It was tarz that was used, tarz and shive that were used, right? And what they really meant by it was a set of techniques, not a style per se, right? Um, and in fact, don't even think style as a concept exists before the late 19th century for Persian and for several other languages as well. I don't think style exists. Even for Bedil, who's such a sort of, you could almost, it's very easy to recognize a verse by Bedil, even if you don't know it's by Bedil, because it's so dense. I don't know if it's a style. Look at these ghazals, for example. I mean, these are the meter. Someone is not his own. Well, of course, the meter can't be your own, but the radif is not his own. The image, so many of the images are not his own. Therefore, they come from Sa'ib, Shaukat, and Nasir Ali. In what sense are these ghazals by Bedil in his own style? It's not clear, right? Because it's too densely intertextual literary culture for style in a modern sense of authorial distinctiveness to even exist, really. Anyway, so yeah, so I agree that it's possible for anyone. Urfi came into India and died in India. I think Saib spent 7 years in India and then went back to Isfahan. So there's nothing Indian about this. It's a certain mode of the ghazal which one might call anachronistically mannerist, in the sense that this is not language that refers to the world. It's language that refers to language that at some point refers to the world, right? That's why Jawab Gui, Istiqbal, writing ghazals in response to ghazals, massively amplifies in this period, right? So these ghazals are really about other ghazals. They're not about social reality, the Sayyid Zurbada, Aurangzeb. The ghazals are not about that. They're not interested in that. They're interested in basically fashioning a poetic universe that is independent or autonomous of social history, right? Yeah, that's what I would say. Did that answer your question more or less? Yeah.
Yes, we did. And lastly, Nagwan Singh has a question. What does Bedil mean? As we have multilingualism in Hindavi poetry. In that sense, what about Persian poetry, especially in the 18th century? How do you see Hindavi presence in the Mughal court? Some of it you have mentioned, but please elaborate your take on it.
Right. So, what does the name Bedil mean? The name Bedil literally means without a heart, but not in the sense of cruel, rather in the sense of someone who has given up his heart to his beloved. His student Bindraban Das Khushgu actually explains his teacher's takhallus. He says that the Be is a is a particle of negation, uh, and that implies Bedil's asceticism, his renunciation of the world, right, for the next world, right? Tarke dunya, basically. He's a tarike dunya, as it were. So that's how he glosses his teacher's name, Bedil. So yeah, you ask about multilingualism, and yeah, well, the great example of multilingualism, of course, Bedil's multilingualism is sort of implicit. You see, he never wrote in any language but Persian, as far as we know, right? There is a Urdu verse attributed to him, but really we don't even know it's by him. Um, but I think he's still a multilingual poet because of all the reasons I've given you today. The ways in which he imitates Sanskritic rhythms, the ways in which he absorbs Sanskritic motifs, especially in his Masnavis. But also, if you read his Masnavis in concert with his Ghazals, you see the same motifs. For example, the peacock's egg, right, which is a famous metaphor from Bhartrihari, but was already present in Khagani, as in poets far from the west of India, from Iranian poets, nothing to do with India. The metaphor was present, but not for the same meaning. The image was present, shall we put it this way, but it wasn't. It was used. So Bedil appropriated its prior presence in 12th century Persian poetry, for example, but put it to use that would have been recognizable to anyone familiar with Sanskrit philosophical grammar, right? That's what he does, you see. So he's multilingual in that sense that he replicates the motions of other languages, rhythmic and conceptual motions, in Persian. Okay, but the other great example of multilingualism, of course, is Azad Bilgrami, Ghulam Ali Azad Bilgrami, right? Bedou's younger contemporary, um, whose Taskire Sarve Azad has a whole section on Braj poets, Braj Muslim poets from Bilgram, who compose naats to the Prophet and so forth in Braj Bhasha. That's a kind of a striking example of that. He even has a theological hadith Sharia-based defense of the uses of Braj, what he calls Hindi, for Muslim devotion, where he shows you, at least claims to show you, that the Quran includes a Hindi word, right? And of course, quotes the famous verse where God says that that I did not send you a prophet except I did not send out a prophet except in the language of his own people. So Azad Bigrami is a good example of a sort of trilingual mastery of Hindavi, Braj, and Arabic in the 18th century. Perhaps the most famous example of this. But you have Shafiq as well, Lakshmi Narayan Shafiq in the 1750s and 1760s in the Deccan, who composes poetry in Urdu and Persian. And in his Gule Rana, the only Tazkira in the history of the Tazkira dedicated only to Hindus, wrote in Persian. In that, he has this interesting comparison of the lover-beloved relationship in Persian, Arabic, and Hindavi. And he says that in Hindavi, we always have a specific mu'ayyin, a specified lover, right, and beloved. And it's a man-woman relationship as opposed to a man-man relationship in the Persian Ghazal, and so forth. So there are several examples of this sort of trilingualism in the 18th century, right?
Thank you, Prashant. It was a lovely evening with you, and
Thank you for having me.
all of us learned a lot. Once again, sorry for the glitches which
All right.
happened. I would just like to end. One thing which I would like to say is that in today's world, when we are living, at least in India, Prashant, not you sitting in America,
In
but
Montreal, America.
Montreal, at least we in India are passing through a phase where we have forgotten our past. Today, we imagine that Persian, Urdu, these are the languages only of the Muslims and have nothing to do with India. Today, you mm, pointed out in a very subtle manner how the poets uh, of Persian language were influenced by the Indian culture, by the Indian genre, and that is something which we should remember. It is not only languages like Rekhta, Urdu, Hindavi, which developed as a result of the mutual contact between different kind of people. But even the language Persian was affected by this give and take, and we find that lot of influences from the non-Persian world started entering into the poetics in Persian language. Today, as I said, that we have almost forgotten that shared past. I am reminded of a poem. I am a very bad person at reciting poetry, but I do remember some of the verses. One which I remember is हवा मुखालिफ व शब्तार व बहर तूफान खेज गुसिस्ता लंगर कश्ती यो ना खुदा खुफ्तास्त. That
Quite
the
fitting.
you know the atmospherics have changed, the airflow is against you, the mast of the ship has broken, even the anchor has gone, and the captain of the ship is sleeping. What to do? I think this is the right time to wake up, remind of our culture, and be aware of what we are. I really once again thank Prashant for bearing with us and delivering this lecture.
Thank
To
you.
the audience, I would like to point out that day after tomorrow, we have another lecture which is quite interesting, and that is by one of the scholars who has been with us before as well, long time back, but has been with us. That is Professor Richard Eaton. And Richard Eaton would be speaking on one of the favorite topics of his. I had personally requested him to speak on that, and that is the issue of the destruction of temples during the pre modern period. So I hope that all of you would once again connect with us and be there to listen to what Eaton has to say. Thank you, all of you. Good night, Prashant.
Good night.
Good night to all of you who joined us today.